Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to Bold Calling. This session is Your Call Dispositions Suck. Here's how to get it right. We're very excited that you've joined us here. This is our inaugural webinar, which is going to be great. I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping before we get started here. We love questions. Ask us questions. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and submit your questions at any point during the session, and we will get to as many of them as we can at the end. And then I also want to invite you to join us next Monday for a webinar that we are doing with Kevin Dorsey, KD. You guys might know him. It's all about how to build an effective calling culture at your company. I've just dropped the registration link for that in the chat, so we would love to see you there next Monday. So our two wonderful speakers today. We first have Terry, who is our VP of Technical Engagement here at Orum. He's got tons of SaaS sales experience, but is currently now back on our CS team, helping to help all of our customers out. We're very excited that you're here. And then also very special, we have Tito, who's the founder and CEO of AltiSales, and we have these two experts who are going to walk us through call dispositions and how you guys can improve your practices there. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Terry and Tito. Welcome. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you for that intro, Laura. And quick housekeeping note, it sounds like chat is disabled.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys.
So we'll see if we can get that going.
Let me look at that.
And yeah, so as she introduced, like, my name is Terry Husayn. I've been on the founding team of Orum since day -30 when we were trying to figure out a name, and I've consulted numerous SDR organizations, and funny enough, me and Tito crossed paths very early on as sales development was starting to explode. So part of what this webinar is about is really about some of the best practices that had been surfaced through a customer to us that had actually originally come from Tito, right? And as we had built out our organization and shared with companies how to think about dispositions and why their dispositions frankly sucked, it was illuminated to me that actually one of our customers had originated this from Tito's learning. So who better than that to help lead this webinar? So super excited to have Tito join us, and super excited to share the last decade of sales development and the experiences that I've gathered.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's been a fun journey. The SaaS co-selling space back in San Francisco, 2015 through 2018. I was there, and that's where we crossed paths as you guys were starting what is Orum today. And I'm proud to be one of the investors in Orum, joined the Series A. So now let's, people can now do a lot more volume with Orum. It's incredible what you guys are able to do with just a parallel dialer or even the power dialer, and get people from, let's say manually, you could potentially do 100 to 150 calls at the most, putting a lot of effort, but it's mentally taxing. And I've seen reps now do 250, 350, 450, 550. I mean, how high can you go, right? And the next question is, okay, now your calls are connecting and people are saying hello, and now what, right? So I'll let you give us a little bit of the outcomes of the calls and how to think about these things.
Thanks, Tito. So, well, yeah, with that, you're getting connected, what, 5-10 times more? So, I want to also note that any of these best practices that we chat about today, you should be doing with your organization, regardless of having a technology like Orum, right? I think best practices are best practices for a reason. And so we should get into, why you should be doing this. Now, what I needed to do is, in order to make this effective and have the data to support the case that you need to change your dispositions, I needed to carefully go back and look at people who are prospects of Orum, free users, people and pilots, essentially anyone that had not yet talked to us about how to change it. Otherwise, that would have muddied the data. So first, let's start with the definitions, the rating system. I'll go over what we found. And then from there, I'm going to hand it off to Tito to talk not only about his calling methodology, but what are the bare minimum dispositions and the reasoning behind them. I think if you're an SDR, I see on the call, and you're in an organization where dispositions aren't serving you, knowing why is going to be super important, so that you can, of course, talk to your management about change management and how this will impact them. As well as if you're a manager here and you need to change dispositions, many times if you're Series B, C, or beyond, those dispositions are tied into reports. Sometimes they're tied into automation. So changing dispositions requires you to bring in more people like sales ops and actually get more buy-in. And so what is a disposition, right? I think for anyone that's chatting about dispositions in terms of specifically sales development, define as really the outcome of the call, what happened. So what I did was I looked at the rating system and I said, okay, let me look at some great dispositions. I was chatting with Tito about this, but great dispositions are granular. You can easily identify the outcomes. Even just the name of the disposition is enough to understand what it can be reported on. You know where to coach specifically, and it can actually be tied into other activity. What I mean is, a disposition could trigger a change in the stage, right? So many SDRs are dealing with buckets of stages. You have people who are in the new stage, they've never been contacted, right? Or people that are in replied or two-way contact, right? Or no longer at a company. So every company has a different set of bucketing methodologies, but the same principles align. And great dispositions actually allow you to automate that process. The next one is good. And good is not as granular, but it flows through the call stages. So kind of the methodology that Tito is going to share, and helps you identify the general areas of coaching. So where in the call are they falling apart, or where in the call are your reps running into problems? But it's also granular enough to where you can get that high level outcome. You know that you can trust your connect rate. You know that you can trust the quality of the dispositions, and you don't have to listen to 1,000 calls. You can use those dispositions to drill down onto the most important ones and get the same outcome. Next one is needs work. And that's when if they did not match good in any way, AKA they suck. That's really where we need people to work on them. So if you can move to the next slide. So what I did was I looked at 50 organizations. I thought this was going to take an hour, ended up taking me almost a whole day to look through these dispositions and then look at if they had any other automation that was set up. Only 2% of the 50 had great dispositions. Then 10% had good dispositions. Outside of that, it was 88%. And what's funny is, as we were preparing for this, one of the things that we're going to talk about is like the next step after good dispositions. Tito kind of pushed back on me. He was like, Terry, you can talk about the future all day long, but I guarantee you 90% of the organizations are not at even the good stage. And whenever you hear someone throw out 90%, right, it's kind of like, are we making up statistics? Is that actually relevant? Because everyone loves to use 90%. So when I actually saw this, I smiled because I was like, oh man, all right, well, I have to admit to Tito that you're actually pretty much on the money. 88%, basically 90% of organizations, 9 out of 10 don't really have good dispositions. So what that means is, for many people who are on this call, if I was to make a bet, I bet that the vast majority of your organizations need to work on better dispositions. So with that, I'll hand it off to Tito on the next slide, and he can talk us through. Tito, you have a calling methodology, and then you also have this framework for what happens when you're connected that I think is simple enough for pretty much any organization to adopt. So can you walk us through, not only the methodology and the principles and even some of the philosophy that you had shared with our CS team, but also how easy it is to get started?
Yeah, and maybe let's go for a second back to the previous slide, because here's what I want to say. How do we know if, here's the way I would have investigated these 50 organizations, and I appreciate you putting the work there, Terry, but if anybody within your call dispositions, you have a disposition that is not interested, you're in the red area over here. Sorry to tell you, but that's the truth. So here's how you gotta be thinking about your call dispositions. I started my career as an SDR 12 years ago. And when I started making phone calls, I would go on LinkedIn and I would keep reading all these gurus saying, hey, dude, you gotta say, do you have 37 seconds so I can tell you why I'm calling? I know the guy would be like, no. You gotta get it from Chris Voss. You gotta ask the, like, did I catch you at a bad time? And then somebody else would be like, no, you gotta be respectful and say, do you have 2 minutes? And somebody else would say, no, you just don't say any of that. You just go straight to the pitch. You just don't say anything. And what I was thinking is, how do I test these out? And how do I measure what's actually working? So the way I organize myself is, rather than hearing like, what is the outcome of the call? Like somebody saying, I have no budget, or I use a competitor, or I am not interested, or call me back later, right? There's many times in calls where more than one of those things happen. Somebody's like, hey, dude, I'm super busy right now. Can you call me back later? And you're like, well, I'm calling, can I take 45 seconds so I can tell you blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm calling from outreach. What do you guys use over there? Sales loft. Now they're with a competitor. And you're like, okay, I love to chat. And they're like, yeah, but hey, dude, we have no budget. So feel free to call me later, but I'm not interested. And you're like, holy shit, is this call back later? Is this no budget? Is this not interested? Is this competitor? Like, you're completely lost. So the way I wanted to organize this for myself in the early days was just, let's just measure my opening line. I want to know how many of my calls are getting through my opening line and how many are not. So if we go to the next slide, what you will see is my first disposition is my introductory line got rejected. So I would go and I would try it for a whole week, right? And I was making $100 a day. Back in the day, I was getting maybe a 5, 6, 7% connect rate. I was talking to maybe 30 people. I would try this intro line. And as long as the disposition was not intro rejected, I'd know that I got through that portion. If it was intro rejected, I would count it as I'm getting stuck up top. And then the next week, I'll try a different intro. And then I'd go back to my data and look, week 1 versus week 2, which one worked better? And that was really cool, because now I knew that the way I was doing the intro in the second week was better. And I could just stick with that for a little while until I saw the numbers dip. Because the same intros, get overused and then they stop working. So you got to be adaptable. You got to be measuring this all the time. The next thing that I thought of is, okay, once I finish my intro line, do you have 37 seconds, or do you have 2 minutes, or X or Y or Z? What happens? Well, the prospect agrees with me and lets me get through that part. I get to what part of my script? And I get to my elevator pitch. I might say, I'm with AltiSales and we're reaching out to you because we're showcasing how companies are improving the SDR efficiency through better training SDRs on cold calling, cold email, and XYZ. How do you currently figure out, what are the highest areas of impact to train your SDRs on? That might be my pitch. Cool. What happens then? Same idea. Some people are going to tell you, go to hell. I'm not interested. I got something in place. I got to run. I'm in a meeting. This is too long of conversation. It doesn't matter what the excuse is, right? If I try to put all the excuses that could potentially come up there, I'm going to end up with 20, 30, 40 connected call dispositions. The only thing you want to mark is, did this work or did this not work? And then if it's not working, then you want to listen to that part of the call and try to understand it. And that methodology continues, right? So you have potentially your receptionist, then you have your introduction getting rejected, you have your elevator pitch getting rejected, then you bump into a qualified conversation. If they respond to that question, there's usually some back and forth dance about the value of this and how it works and how it's different. And then eventually you get your closing statement. Hey, can we meet on Friday, 10 a.m.? Once that works, you always get either one of 2 positive outcomes if you're not fully stuck there. You can get a referral or you can get a meeting set. So for us, in my world, the way to set up the minimum viable coaching framework for my SDRs is to have these 6 dispositions deployed for every organization. And with this, you'll be able to, 1, compare SDR1 versus SDR2 versus SDR3, see where each person is getting stuck. The people who are having the worst conversion at any step of the call, have them listen to the calls of the others. And you can also evaluate if any of your SDR or if all your SDRs are getting stuck in a certain place, you run a group training on it. So that's the basic framework. And I think if you're out of those 88% of the organizations that aren't doing this yet, if they move in this direction, or if they fully implement this methodology, you're gonna start doing much, much better via phone.
Tito, that's and one of the things that caught my And there's also a question from the group, and this might tie into Malcolm's question that I was typing out is, one of the things that I had issues with my SDR teams in the past, and, luckily at Orum, like, had a fantastic SDR team. We talk about data-driven stuff, but at previous organizations or even SDR as a new SDR manager, we rarely ever did we A/B test, scripts, right? We might have had something that was similar to this, but we weren't diligent enough to say, hey, this week you're using script A as your opener and script B next, or hey, SDR, Wednesday and Thursday you're on this script, Monday, Tuesday you're on this script, Friday let's look at the data. And then also how long, how many calls, how much data before you get, a significant p-value, right? Is it going to be below 0.05, above 0.05? Like, so when you're doing this using your MVP framework, how can teams be more diligent about what was testing? And then after that question, that might lead into the question from Malcolm, which is like, is there any intro lines that perform best according to the data?
Yeah, so let me summarize. One is how much data do you need? And the second one is what works better, right? So how much data you need is actually not something I need to answer, because this is very simply statistics, right? Like we don't need to figure out which one works better or doesn't work better. This is used in like marketing campaigns. Companies will put 2 different ads on Facebook and see which one gets higher clicks. There's a mathematical formula that will tell you at what point one variable has beaten the other. This is done in all sorts of research and testing. Every university that's running like a lot of research is doing a ton of experiments. Like if you read ever in the New York Times that coffee is bad for you, or coffee is good for you, or this is good for you, or that is bad for you, or asbestos is giving people cancer. Like those aren't just like, oh, guess what? Like this person wasn't in an asbestos environment, go cancer once. Like we should sue. No, like there's data and there's statistic, and then like things are defined with a mathematical model. Now, long term, you can use a mathematical model, or whatever. I'm gonna plug it in, but like at AltiSales.io, the plugin that we built for outreach, we actually have a calculation in the background that will give you exactly the point at which you have the statistical significance of something working or not working better than another thing. But in the early days, you don't really care. Just try it 30 times or 40 or 50 times each thing. And wait, give it a whole week worth of data. Don't change too quickly. Too many people get too desperate to like change. Don't change. Just wait, hold on, do it for a week. Don't change anything for a week, and then collect the data. And then the next week, change it around and collect the data, and then look at it. And whichever beat the other, that's who you should go to. That's a high level idea. Now, somebody just asked, what worked better? What is truly the statistically known way that you should open a call? And I'll tell you, it depends on the target persona you're calling. Because here's what we've learned. If I go, I'm going to give you 2 very easy examples. I'm going to use the same opening line, but for 2 personas. I'm going to use it for a VP of sales and for a head of engineering. If I talk to a VP of sales, I'm like, hey man, Tito from AltiSales, do you have 2 minutes? Right? And they say, no, I'm busy. What we ask our SDRs to do is to say, come on, Terry, you're a head of sales. I'm in sales too. Would you mind giving me 45 seconds? And heads of sales usually say, fuck yeah, go ahead, right? If you try to do that with an engineer, you're stuck. It won't work. If an engineer says, I'm super busy, what we tend to say is, no big deal. I'll send you an email. Let me confirm this with you. Are you at terry@orum.com? And they say, yes. It's like, cool, awesome. Sending you an email. We'll talk soon. Bye. And we see those emails getting opened a lot. So your intro and how you not only handle the intro, but how you handle the rejections to the intros, and then how you turn those intro rejections either into, you turn them around and you turn them into an acceptance so that you can get to step 2 of the call, which is a quick elevator pitch. Also change according to your persona. So therefore, 1, the answer is it depends, but there's the things that it depends on and how you handle it. And number 2, I can't tell you which one works best because it depends on who you're calling. And even if you tell me who you're calling, I won't tell you what works the best because That's what I do for a living. I can't give you all my secrets.
Well, Tito, on that note, though, it's like one thing that I think we can share from our data is because we have a lot of different customers and what we've seen. And again, like this is the problem with data, right? Because if it's not as rigorous as you said, it comes off as anecdotal. But what we have found is that social openers usually work the best regardless of persona. And that means that usually comes from that referral. So if anyone picks up the phone and you're like, hey, actually, I just spoke to your VP of engineering. He mentioned I should reach out to you two directly. And these were the problems we were discussed. Do you have a moment to chat? They might still say I'm busy, to your point, right? And then your follow-up email is there, but you are going to have a higher chance for them to let you spit out why, you're reaching out to them. What we've noticed is that anytime that you're able to put in any sort of strategic research, any personalization, and you're able to tell them why their company, why now, why them specifically, and permission-based opener. So saying like, hey, can I tell you a little bit more about what we do? And you can tell me if it makes sense to schedule a longer conversation, tends to work the best regardless of your ICP. But what happens after that is, I think, something that, Tito, I have to agree with you, like saying, hey, well, you're a VP of sales, like, give me 45 seconds. Like I get those calls. I'm like, yeah, I'm an SDR leader. Like it would look bad on me to just shut down an SDR over a cold call when I ask my SDRs to cold call, right? Like what kind of hypocrite am I? So I think there's some general frameworks that work, but I think after that, to your point, for many organizations that target IT security, the first cold call is the opener. It's the I'm a human, you're a human, we've connected. It's really the follow-up game that tends to be where reps drop the ball, but also where most of the meetings tend to essentially occur. Is that what you see, Tito, as well? Or what do you see on what happens after that initial connect?
Yeah, obviously, if you can get a meeting, you should always get a meeting. However, there's so many different ways to approach a call, right? If you can't get a meeting, try to get a referral, or try to get information, right? Like for us, we're starting to do a lot more outbound for ourselves because we've built the software part of the business, which is AltiSales.io, and we only talk to companies that are using outreach. The reason we do that is because only outreach is connected with our plugin. So if you're on Salesforce, we can't necessarily give you a product. So we've identified, I think it's 4,000 target accounts that we want to go after. All these have been identified as companies that have BDRs or SDRs. Out of those, we were able to find some smart ways to figure out who uses outreach. But now we have a list of, I think, like, I don't know, 1,100 companies or whatever that have more than 5 SDRs, and we don't know what tool they use. So if I call you or email you or whatever, if you're not on outreach, we'll still have like one little feature that we can sell you, but it's a very small portion. So my ultimate goal is, if you have outreach, getting into a meeting ASAP. But if you don't have outreach, I want to know what you're using, because then that's also going to inform, for example, in our case, like product feedback. What else should we integrate with in the future? How are we going to go about this in the next, 6 to 12 to 18 months or whatever else? So information gathering is also incredibly helpful. And regardless of where you get stuck, what I tell people is, even when you look at these 6 call dispositions, don't judge like, oh yeah, this person is getting stuck a lot here, like that's so bad. It's not so bad. Like, think that this is an area where you can find where you can coach, because those conversions could be higher. But the fact that you're getting stuck doesn't necessarily mean that the call was a failure. It just means that it stopped there. And sometimes you're finding the sales engagement tool they're using, the processes they're using, the timeline that they're gonna be like looking for a new solution or whatever else. So all that is very, very positive.
Got it. That's actually a really solid way to move into the next slide. And so it was hard for me to get all these dispositions on this next slide without like it just looking terrible. So I apologize to everyone who's looking at the slide. But these are some of the Orum best practice dispositions that were pulled from one of our most successful customers who had built this framework off of what Tito had already built. So what we did here is, when you actually are getting 5 to 10 times more connects, you can actually add more granularity. And so one of the things that you'll see is, elevator pitch rejected is the same as, you know, the intro rejected, right? You couldn't get past and you can't even get your pitch. But then we looked at how can you scale the rest of the data operations as an SDR organization? So one of the things that's tough love about the SDR orgs in the world is that for many SDR organizations, they are run really inefficiently. And because of that, it ends up increasing the CAC, the customer acquisition cost of an organization. So when you go through layoffs and you go through problematic times in the economy, who's the first team to get hit? It's almost always the SDRs, right? Organizations look at it as a line item that is expensive and that it's actually increasing the cost of their acquisition. And right now, maybe they don't want to acquire new customers. Maybe they just want to hold on and survive. But if you can actually leverage more of the outputs to other inputs, you can drive organizational change. So for example, what Tito mentioned was there's an objection on here for already have a solution, right? And it's down the middle. The prospect already has a solution for your services. When I see that, right, to me, I'm not like, oh man, my SDR sucks at this. They really should have overcome this. My eyes light up because I'm like, oh, what are they using, right? And then I can tell you that other organizations that use similar dispositions, I've literally listened to a call where the person says, yes, I would love to use your solution, but you know, we're really using this other Kubernetes security provider. It's kind of clunky. And it's like $200,000 a year. So like, you know, we kind of do want to replace it, but it's not up until September. Can you reach out in June? And those notes aren't written down. They're not updated in Salesforce, right? But I would pay $1,000 per account name if I could tell what they were using, when the contract was due, and if they're a direct competitor. I mean, that is thousands of dollars worth of information, right? So as you get into more granularity, you can start using these. And the way that we coach here is that what was the top objection that you felt was the root one, right? If it was no budget, choose that. Already asked to send info. I mean, that meant there's probably a bunch of ones. We're still going to listen to that and help you coach. But how can you use more specific dispositions so that you can not only clean your data, but you can actually help your entire organization? So for example, if the objection is, I can't use your system, Terry, because you don't integrate into Groove, for example. We integrate into Outreach, SalesLoft, HubSpot, Salesforce. We have many more on the way. But you know, Groove's actually a very popular one in some of the enterprise clients. If we see that happen a lot, we'll actually ping our product team. That's what happened with HubSpot. We didn't have a HubSpot integration, but our SDRs had so many conversations where they couldn't book a meeting because we couldn't integrate with HubSpot that we sent that to the product team. They saw what was going on with the front lines. We built the integration and it immediately started generating revenue. So power of dispositions goes beyond just coaching. It can change the way that your product looks, the way your product operates. It can even change the type of ICP that you're going after. And so the more granular you are, without getting, you know, lost in 50, 60 dispositions, you can actually start automatically changing the way that your company scales. And I'll show that in the next slide is what's kind of next, but I'll pause here for, you know, thoughts on your end, Tito, because I know that from your perspective, sometimes this can be a little overkill. It's probably best to start with your methodology first. And after they nail that, like what else are they seeing that they feel they could actually partition into a more granular set of dispositions?
Yeah, and I would love to hear from the audience too. Like, what are dispositions that you have available, right? Like, obviously, Terry, you guys run a sophisticated team, very phone oriented, call heavy. You use your own tool, you leverage it, and you have a lot of them here, right? So as an SDR, I also need to be onboarded and trained, and you know, like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. You have like 22, 24, or whatever. I'm not going to count them exactly, but like I need to learn what these 24 exactly mean and like make sure that I'm not messing up, right? So like the way I tried to set it up in the early days is let's just put 6 dispositions for connected calls and maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 for not connected calls. You can have your just no pickup, maybe a voicemail, maybe like, I don't know, a receptionist, which I don't consider a connect, and then a non-prospecting call, whatever you were doing a follow-up or whatever else. So that should fall outside of your prospecting dispositions, because it's not a prospecting, it's a follow-up call or whatever else. So yeah, I feel like organizations should take a small step in the right direction, implement the minimum viable dispositions, and then once you have a big ops team and you want to architect a lot of like different workflows and processes, there's a lot that can be done.
That's actually a good segue, I think, into the next slide, which is some FAQs before we get into like the future, right? So here are some of the FAQs that we got initially when we were sharing it with some people on our team. And so, for example, Tito, when you're looking at your initial framework, how do you leverage these best practices, right? You mentioned there's a lot of coaching aspect. Maybe there's extracting data. You mentioned, hey, this person, is using something that you don't integrate with, cleaning up data. Like, what are your best practices there? How do you scale that?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you can actually do. So, and it's also about creating the workflows around the dispositions. So one of the interesting things is, you have your 24 dispositions that automatically trigger a lot of stuff. Now, in the early days, you don't want to create that many. It's going to be overwhelming. So what we really recommend is make sure that everybody's taking notes and creating the next actions. So you should just have, let's say, let's say sequences for different scenarios. So if somebody is like, hey, call me in 6 months, you should have a sequence where you can add somebody to, right, which is a follow-up sequence, and then you go into that sequence and you snooze that task up until the day that it's due. So that way I know exactly when I need to call. It gets put in the sequence, it gets put in process. And then once every couple of weeks, I have my data team go and ensure that there's no leads assigned to SDRs that are no longer with the company, or that have moved to other projects, or that are doing something else, right? Or they got promoted to AEs or anything like that. Because there will be also a lot of times that, like, a lot of companies, like, you have an SDR that gets promoted. They are now assigned to a new territory, and they had 20 or 30 or 50 leads that had follow-ups, and they were in sequence, and those are still assigned to the old SDR, and the SDR has moved on. He's no longer prospecting. Whatever might have happened, they were let go. And like, there's a lot of gold there, and if you're not looking at that, you're missing out. So it's not only about like the coaching aspect of building kind of like a process of where are my reps getting stuck and how can I help them, but also the ability to like you're saying here, cleaning up the data, right? It's also not crazy to either connect this to your CRM and then run reports on it, or even we do this too, like out of the call, all the calls that have been placed, we grab all of the ones that were connected. We download the data in a big CSV file, and we start looking for keywords such as outreach, sales loft, or whatever, training or budget or things like that. And then we can sort and filter, figure out what are the companies that are mentioning certain things, and create specific plays or specific sequences for that. So again, if you're taking diligent notes, you might be able to backtrack and find a lot of these insights and course correct, rather than having to do everything just at the moment of the connect and try to deploy one of the 22 call dispositions. So that's how I would optimize my workflows for number one.
So for number one, though, that also brings up a thought out of mind, is like, if you have a chorus or gong, I think you'd be able to set up the systems to start looking for those keywords too. Is that one way to let's say if you're someone who already uses Gong today, maybe you're piping in your calls. Maybe the next step for you is to say, hey, listen, like, as Tito mentioned, maybe I should start putting in these keywords and seeing if I can kind of extract insights across the team. Is that something that you've seen work before?
Yeah, you can do it. You got to be careful sometimes, because what I don't like about the just direct transcription of data or some of these like big data models is, maybe I have an SDR that when he's calling, he says, hey, are you on outreach? Right. And then people sometimes say yes, sometimes say no, sometimes they whatever else, right? And then if you look for the keyword outreach, you might find it in the call script, right? Oh yeah, this call mentions outreach. And if you're analyzing, I don't know, right? Like each SDR with Orum, 300 to 500 calls a day, 3% connect rate, 15 connects a day. You have 10 SDRs, there's 150 connects a day. If you're analyzing the data for the month, you're analyzing 3,000 connects. You're not going to go look one by one to see, oh, this call transcription says outreach. That, like, let's see what the context was. You're just going to be like, oh, these say outreach, all those customers have outreach. And it might be wrong. It might be that the SDR asked, do you have outreach? And then the prospect said no, but the keyword is there. You know what I mean? So you gotta be careful. Sometimes trying to go too fast or just extract data too quickly can hurt you. So my best piece of advice is make sure you take diligent notes.
Got it. And then number 2 came up, which was, you mentioned that sometimes there's multiple dispositions, right? And if you have a lot of calls, or let's say you have a 50-person SDR team, and you want to really drill down on which ones are giving them the most amount of issues, sometimes they overcome multiple objections in a call. How does a rep choose the right disposition, so that you as a manager can hone in on where they need help? Is it the diligent notes part? Or if you have objection-based dispositions, do they choose the one that got them stumped? Like how do you approach that with your SDRs?
Yeah, so here's the way I think about it. Again, once you build a sophisticated system like you, Terry, you can do both. Your disposition can have where they're getting stuck, as well as, what's the desired kind of like course of action. And you might have something called, qualified pitch timing. And then that both gives me the ability to train the SDR, but also understand, what the problem was. And you might have a workflow there. Like, okay, you're going to call him back in 3 months or 6 months or whatever. What I like doing is some of these objections have their own sequences. So like we have a sequence for somebody using a competitor or somebody not having budget, right? And your first email is it's like a sequence, and it says, inexpensive ways to improve your SDR capabilities. And if it was timing, it might be an email that says why, changing call dispositions today is better than blah blah blah, or like the urgency on call dispositions, like something that addresses that timing concern. So what I have my SDRs do is they actually never have a disposition that is based on these names. We don't say there's a disposition called timing or no budget or competitor or not interested or anything like that. The only thing I have them do is they disposition the call directly. And then within the platform, they resequence that lead into a new sequence. And the sequence they send it to is what they believe was a primary reason why this person did not move forward. And when it's timing, we might just, that sequence might not start for another 3 months, right? Like move this guy to a new sequence. The new sequence has the first step. You can set this up in Outreach instead of being immediate or in 2 minutes or in 20 minutes. It doesn't start for 3 months. So anybody who said timing, they just get called the next quarter. That's it. And then that list is gold.
Okay. And then, and that's super helpful. The other one that came up too was, and I get this question a lot, is, hey, Orum, you sometimes have a 10% conversation to meeting ratio, or hey, you got 10 connects and you guys booked a meeting. And then some SDR organizations, they have no meetings booked, but they book most of their meetings from follow-up. But you look at analytics and it's like, oh, they suck at cold calling, but for some reason they have a 50% lift in their meetings anyway. And so the question starts to become is, for meeting set, like, what's a good percentage to aim for, right? Is there baseline ones? Does it depend on ICP? Should we care about meeting set on the first call? Like, what have you seen, and how have you tend to, coach and advise SDR organizations you speak with?
I think obviously it will depend on the type of leads you're calling, right? Like I know organizations with SDRs spend most of the time just calling MQLs or companies that have signed up for a free trial or people like that. There's other organizations that call SMB accounts. They're fine getting an individual contributor into a meeting, while other organizations only want VPs and C levels who tend to have much more packed calendars. So I would say every organization, if you're calling high and you're cold calling, if you're at 8% or higher, you're actually doing well. That's what you should aim for. And when you think about those metrics, like let's say you're using Orum, you're making 250 dials a day, you're connecting at a 4% connect rate. Right. So you're connecting with what is that? 10 individuals a day. If you're connecting with 10, 8% would mean that you're getting 4 meetings a week. So that's 50 connects a week. You're turning 8% of 50. That's 8 meetings a week. If you can do that, you're doing great. Now it also depends. If you're calling MQLs and signups and things like that, I would imagine you should be at like 12, 13, 15%. The top SDRs that I've seen tend to stay at over 20% connect to meeting ratio. That means 1 out of 5 leads that picks up the phone gets into a meeting. And then if you're under, like, let's say 3%, I think you have a lot of work to do.
Wow. Yeah, 20%. I've definitely seen that for some organizations and some of our top cold callers. So I definitely know it's possible. Yeah, I always thought I was one of the best cold callers, and then I saw that, I was like, okay, wow. Numbers don't lie, right? So that's good to know. Like we see something similar. Like we like to see anywhere from 5 to 20%. But if you're getting below 5%, we like to then dive into outreach and see what happened after the call. Like, okay, you had a great call. You couldn't close them for a meeting, but it sounded like the call went really well. Like what happened after? And I think that's also where you see a lot of organizations fail to dive into, because they don't even have the dispositions to even look for that call, right? And I think that goes back to kind of the insights aspect. All right, so I think what we can do is we should move to the next slide. I'll go over it very briefly because it is really for future state orgs, but just painting the picture for all the attendees here. Most orgs are not at this state, but you could get to this state. Anyone could get to this state. You don't need Orum for this. So, most orgs could do this. If you have Outreach, SalesLoft, HubSpot, then the 99.9 makes sense. Again, if you're on Apollo, Groove, you could still do it as long as you have any sort of sales engagement platform that allows you to trigger dispositions into new sequences. Like this is a future state that is possible. And this is also really a solid way to not only for SDRs to crush it and keep their jobs, but for organizations to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, really look deeply at the value the SDR organizations are producing and making sure that we're not letting it drop through the funnel. There's a lot of blame on SDRs right now. And honestly, it should be on the managers. It is tough. It is fucking tough out there. And everyone knows that. Instead of improving organizations, you have some that get rid of their SDRs. You have some other organizations that double down and they take a scalpel to their processes and they come out winning, right? And so we really want, as someone, Tino and I care deeply about SDRs. I think me and him have argued vehemently for SDR organizations to have it being a 6-figure plus job at minimum. I still feel very strongly about all of that. And so how do you get to this stage, right, where you're an SDR is producing 50 to 100% more meetings than normal? So what we like to look at is how can you create processes that replace you in terms of human capital, not replace you as replacing the SDR and they're gone, but actually replacing the work that you're doing so that you can focus on the other things that don't scale. So, if you're going to your manager and saying, hey, we need better dispositions, we need for better coaching, we need this call methodology, right? Or if you're a manager on the line and you don't even have the 6 basic ones that, Tito shared, you want to, of course, share with them what goes beyond that, right? Sales ops becomes your friend. Sales ops typically doesn't work very closely with SDR organizations as much as they should. And you want to think about what happens after the call. So here at Orum, whenever someone says, hey, I don't have a priority, we actually trigger that disposition using outreach, and we put them into a sequence that is a sequence specifically designed to overcome that objection. Now, to Tito's point earlier, you can have multiple objections. So the way that we train our SDRs is, after you came over those objections, which ones did you overcome? And the ones that you couldn't and you felt was like the root objection, use that as your methodology for framework. And if they say objection, not right now, timing was not the right one, they tend to give you the real one, right? So for example, if you go into the sequence, you're calling them with context. Hey, Terry, we spoke last week, right? You mentioned that timing was off. And the reason I was reaching out is I shot over some material. I would just love to show you how it works. When timing is absolutely correct and maybe budget realigns, whenever it actually makes sense to look at Orum, we can always offer a free trial. But let's see if it's even worth your time to think about, because in the meantime, you can work on some of these best practices. Maybe in the meantime, I'll send you Tito's best practices. You can deploy that anyway, because you need to. And he says, yeah, that's great. But Terry, actually the reason is we already have a solution. Okay, well, I select that disposition. Now they're in that sequence. So for most organizations, once you get an objection, you might respond via email and you might make one more call. But very few organizations actually have the dispositions that will push you to the next stage. And then to Tito's point, doing things that don't scale. Did you create a follow-up task? Did you diligently follow up with them after that connection to overcome? Most organizations, and being an SDR myself, you tend to try to hit quota, right? Because that is the goal. But there's this whole swath of meetings that could help you crush it, but they might not get booked in the quarter that your quota counts. So it tends to fall through. So overcoming objections is definitely a part of the job, but now more than ever, you're getting more replies over email, social, and calling. Back in the day, I was ecstatic if I got 2 or 3 connects in a day. I was like overjoyed if someone replied to my email, even if they said no, because I was like, I'm going to overcome this objection. That was like most of your job, but just overcoming objections, right? So as you increase, as you get better with dispositions, the future is there for you to really automate the rest of this workflow to really help, create an SDR organization that is just absolutely crushing it. I know that we're at 147. I'll probably hand it off to Tito's for any closing remarks, and also hand it off to the rest of our attendees for any questions that you may have in the remaining time that we have here.
I don't have a lot more to add. I think most organizations, again, just follow what is out of the box, right? If you buy Outreach or you buy SalesLoft or you buy any of the sales engagement tools, they come with out of the box dispositions, and they include things like not interested and things like, call back later. And they don't know better, because the people who build those processes weren't heavy on the phone. They built it with the idea of like just creating sequences that were mostly email based, right? If you read the predictable revenue book, or if you listen to, let's say, Manny Medina's early days and his story, he was just blasting emails left and right. And then they added the phone as an additional tool, but they didn't know how to configure it properly. So for those of us who have been nerds in the world of making phone calls, we found the ways. We found the ways to make it better. And you got to change it, because the out of the box is not going to cut it. So hopefully people are finding a lot of value in the dispositions we shared. Hopefully you took a screenshot, whatever, go share it with your team. And if you have further questions, if you're in Outreach, I love to talk to people, show them a little bit of what we've set up over here for the Outreach plugin. We can connect everything directly to your call dispositions, adapt them dynamically, help you understand where your SDRs are getting stuck, provide even trainings to your team, make it really easy and really awesome to increase your performance. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming.